Dear viewers, we're witnessing the establishment of the energy infrastructure that will determine North America's geopolitics for the next half-century. On January 15th, 2026, at a press conference held in Beijing against the backdrop of a traditional Chinese pavilion, Canadian Energy Minister Tim Hodgson appeared before the international media to announce the largest shift in energy flow in modern history. Canada will build $109 billion worth of liquefied natural gas, export facilities on the Pacific coast, designed entirely for shipment to Asian markets, with an annual production capacity of 50 million tons by 2030. Not a single molecule from these facilities will flow to the US. The American energy market has been completely sidelined in favor of Chinese investments and Asian demand. President Donald Trump, who for months threatened Canada with tariffs and suggested military annexation, has only now realized that while he was making threats, Canada was building permanent infrastructure that would eliminate American energy power forever. The scale of this transformation cannot be overstated. 50 million tons of liquefied natural gas per year represents approximately 18.5% of Asia's entire LNG import market. Starting from zero in Pacific LNG exports today, Canada is becoming one of the largest suppliers to the world's fastest growing energy market within 4 years. This is not a gradual adaptation to existing trade models. It is the deliberate construction of an entirely new energy architecture, oriented not toward the United States in the south, but toward the Pacific in the west. The infrastructure enabling this shift is already under construction. 7 major LNG export projects are being developed in the various stages in British Columbia. LNG Canada and Kitimat began operations in 2025 and is rapidly expanding to reach its designed capacity of 14 million tons per year. Cedar LNG aims to begin operations in 2028 with a capacity of 3.75 million tons per year. Woodfibre LNG also aims to begin operations in 2028 with a capacity of 2.1 million tons. Ksi Lisims LNG is scheduled to begin operations in 2029 with an annual capacity of 12 million tons. Together with additional projects and planned expansions, these facilities will achieve the 50 million tons of production announced by Minister Hodgson in Beijing. What makes this development particularly consequential is not merely the volume of gas being redirected, but who is financing and controlling these facilities. Chinese companies are not simply buying Canadian LNG on spot markets. They are investing equity capital, owning production facilities, and securing long-term supply agreements that guarantee deliveries for decades. LNG Canada, the flagship project, demonstrates the model perfectly. The facility represents a $40 billion investment owned by a consortium of 5 international companies. Shell holds 40%, Malaysia's Petronas owns 25%, PetroChina controls 15%, Mitsubishi holds 15%, and Korea Gas Corporation owns 5%. PetroChina's 15% stake means that China owns a direct equity interest in Canada's first major LNG export facility. This is not a customer relationship. This is integrated ownership of Canadian energy infrastructure by Chinese state-owned enterprises. Minister Hodgson made this explicit when he told reporters that China is an investor in our first LNG project. They are going to be an investor in our second LNG project, and they are a major user of our conventional oil and gas. China is embedding itself throughout the Canadian energy value chain, from upstream production through midstream processing to export terminals. The strategic logic behind Chinese investment rather than simple purchase agreements is straightforward. By owning production capacity, China secures supply regardless of market conditions, political complications, or attempts by third parties to interfere with energy flows. Once Chinese capital has built Canadian facilities, those facilities operate for 30 to 40 years and cannot be redirected to serve American markets. They are built specifically for Pacific export, with infrastructure designed for Asian destinations. The $109 billion in capital investment represents the largest infrastructure build-out in Canadian energy history. All 7 export projects are located in British Columbia on the Pacific coast, with deep water ports and direct shipping routes to Asia. There is no dependence on American infrastructure, no transit through American territory, and no vulnerability to American political interference. Kitimat is becoming a global LNG hub, home to LNG Canada and other clustered projects, including Cedar LNG, Ksi Lisims LNG, and Woodfibre LNG. All using the same regional infrastructure and creating a permanent industrial base oriented toward Pacific trade. The employment implications are enormous. Construction requires tens of thousands of workers during the build-out phase. Operations create permanent high-wage jobs in communities that previously relied on resource extraction with limited processing. Supporting industries develop around the core facilities. Supply chains establish themselves, and the region transforms from raw resource export to advanced energy processing. Compare this to Alberta oil or Saskatchewan potash, which remain dependent on American markets and vulnerable to American tariff threats. British Columbia LNG ships directly to Asia, serves Asian customers, is funded by Asian capital, and is integrated into Asian energy security planning. The United States is completely bypassed, and President Trump has zero leverage over these facilities once they are operational. Infrastructure creates what economists call path dependency. Once built, facilities operate for decades. Long-term contracts lock in customers. Supply agreements guarantee volumes. The infrastructure cannot be easily redirected to serve different markets. It is built for Asia permanently, and that permanence is what makes this shift so strategically significant. Asia is the growth market for LNG, and the numbers demonstrate why Canadian producers are willing to make this enormous capital commitment. Japan, South Korea, China, India, Taiwan, Thailand, and Singapore are all major importers. Combined, these markets consumed approximately 270 million tons of LNG in 2025. Projections indicate demand will reach 350 million tons by 2030. Almost all of that 80 million ton increase comes from China and India. China is the critical buyer in this equation. The country imported approximately 90 million tons of LNG in 2025. Projections show Chinese imports reaching 120 million tons by 2030, representing a 30 million ton increase in just 5 years. That increase alone is larger than Canada's entire planned export capacity, which means there is enormous room for Canadian supply to grow within the Chinese market without displacing other suppliers. Why does China need so much LNG? The country is replacing coal for electricity generation to reduce air pollution in major cities, meeting climate commitments under international agreements, providing industrial feedstock for chemical plants, and supplying residential heating in urban areas. Natural gas produces approximately half the carbon emissions of coal when burned for electricity, which makes it an attractive transition fuel as China moves away from its heavy reliance on coal-fired power plants. China specifically prefers Canadian LNG for reasons beyond simple availability. Prime Minister Carney emphasized during the Beijing visit that we produce the lowest carbon intensity LNG in the world. This matters because of how British Columbia's facilities are powered. Most LNG facilities worldwide burn natural gas to power the compression and cooling equipment required for liquefaction. This generates significant emissions and reduces the climate benefit of switching from coal to gas. Canadian facilities use renewable electricity from BC Hydro's extensive hydroelectric system. This cuts emissions by approximately half compared to the global average. The carbon intensity of Canadian LNG is approximately 0.15 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of LNG produced, compared to a global average of 0.26 to 0.35 tons. For China, which has committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2060, this lower carbon intensity matters strategically. It allows China to increase natural gas consumption while reducing overall emissions, supporting both economic growth and climate commitments simultaneously. Japan and South Korea represent additional key markets with similar strategic logic. Both countries are heavily dependent on LNG because they have few domestic energy resources and must import fuel to meet electricity demand. Japan, especially after the Fukushima nuclear shutdown in 2011, experienced a massive demand spike that helped build the Asian LNG market into what it is today. The ownership stakes that Mitsubishi and Korea Gas Corporation hold in LNG Canada reflect Japanese and Korean strategic interests in securing long-term supply, locking in pricing structures, guaranteeing delivery, and reducing exposure to price spikes or supply disruptions. This is the same logic driving Chinese investment. Ownership of production facilities provides security that purchase agreements alone cannot guarantee. Canada benefits from a significant geographic advantages in serving Asian markets. The Pacific Coast is closer to Asian destinations than the American Gulf Coast. Shipping distances are shorter, transport costs are lower, delivery times are faster, and supply reliability is higher. American LNG from Louisiana or Texas must transit through the Panama Canal or around South America to reach Asian markets. Canadian LNG ships directly across the Pacific Ocean. The economics decisively favor Canadian supply when serving Asian customers. Here is where the shock to the United States becomes clear. Canada currently ships almost all of its natural gas production to American markets through an extensive network of pipelines connecting Alberta and British Columbia gas fields to American distribution networks. The United States has been the default customer for Canadian natural gas for generations. This relationship created enormous American leverage over Canadian energy policy because Canadian producers had no alternative markets for their gas. But that relationship is ending. Prime Minister Carney stated explicitly during the Beijing announcement that Canada is scaling up LNG exports to Asia to 50 million tons per year by 2030, all destined for Asian markets, not United States markets. This represents a complete Pacific orientation and Asian focus, with the American market deliberately abandoned. The question that American policymakers must now confront is why Canada chose to abandon its traditional market. The answer lies in President Trump's behavior over the past year. The tariffs, the threats, the unpredictability, the political risk, the weaponization of trade relationships, and the suggestions that Canada should become the 51st American state created an environment where long-term energy contracts with the United States seemed dangerously unreliable. Canadian energy executives watched Trump impose tariffs in February, suspend some in April, reimpose higher rates in June, threaten even higher duties in August, and promise further escalation. They watched him suggest military action against Canada. They watched him tear up trade agreements and disregard diplomatic norms. They drew the obvious conclusion that the United States is an unreliable partner, and that building 50-year infrastructure based on a relationship that might end with the next presidential tweet represents unacceptable risk. Asia offers an alternative with characteristics that make long-term investment viable. Asian buyers sign long-term contracts spanning 20 to 30 years. They demonstrate stable demand growth driven by economic development and energy transition needs. They are willing to invest capital directly in production facilities. They maintain respectful diplomatic relationships without annexation threats or suggestions of military control. They treat Canada as a sovereign partner rather than a subordinate territory. The contrast could not be more stark, and Canadian energy companies have made their choice clear through capital allocation decisions. They are building for Asia because Asia represents a reliable, growing, respectful market that values Canadian supply. The infrastructure being built makes this redirection permanent and irreversible. All new terminals face the Pacific Ocean, all export capacity points toward Asian destinations, all contracts commit supply to Asian buyers for decades. Even if the United States wanted Canadian LNG in the future, the infrastructure does not exist to deliver it because Canadian capital went to Pacific facilities rather than connections to American markets. The United States has lost strategic leverage it held for half a century. Previously, Washington could threaten Canada economically because Canadian energy had no alternative markets. Now Canada has alternatives, growing alternatives that Chinese investment has made permanent and secure. President Trump's reaction to this development is entirely predictable. He will claim that Canada is undermining American energy security. He will threaten retaliation through higher tariffs or other punitive measures. He will demand that Canada prioritize the American market and redirect some LNG export capacity southward. But the leverage necessary to enforce those demands no longer exists. Trump cannot force Canada to build different infrastructure. He cannot redirect Pacific terminals toward the Atlantic. He cannot break long-term contracts that Canadian companies have signed with Asian buyers. The infrastructure decisions have been made, the capital has been committed, and the outcome is locked in. The Memorandum of Understanding that Minister Hodgson signed on January 15th makes this relationship formal and institutional. Canada and China agreed to establish a ministerial dialogue on energy cooperation with meetings every 12 to 18 months for at least 5 years. This creates a framework for expanding energy trade across multiple dimensions. The document states explicitly that participants recognize Canada as an important potential partner in responsibly produced and reliable global oil, LNG, and LPG supply, and will explore opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation. The focus areas include oil and gas resource development, liquefied natural gas, liquefied petroleum gas, and emission reductions. The document also recognizes that conventional energy continues to play an important role in the energy transition, which represents both countries acknowledging that natural gas will be needed during the decades-long shift toward renewable energy sources. China wants secure supplies during that transition, and Canada is willing to provide them. The memorandum also addresses clean energy cooperation, recognizing potential for partnerships in offshore wind and solar development. This opens a door to Canada potentially importing clean technology from China while exporting fossil fuels, creating a comprehensive energy partnership spanning both conventional and renewable sources. Minister Hodgson emphasized that the conversation has changed since LNG Canada started shipping to Asia. China has made clear they need a lot of energy, especially clean energy, and they're looking for reliable trading partners that do not use energy for coercion. That last phrase is particularly significant. China is explicitly referencing Russia's weaponization of energy against Europe during the Ukraine conflict. China wants alternative suppliers who provide energy for commercial purposes rather than political leverage. Canada fits that role perfectly. As a democratic country with rule of law, reliable institutions, and no history of using energy exports as geopolitical weapons, Canada represents an ideal partner from the Chinese perspective. The memorandum also commits both countries to strengthening exchanges in natural uranium trade. Canada is a major uranium producer, and China is building dozens of nuclear reactors that require reliable uranium supply. This represents another area where Canada offers China an alternative to politically unstable or unreliable sources. Beyond the future LNG potential, the Energy Cooperation Framework unlocks immediate trade benefits. Prime Minister Carney announced nearly $3 billion in new export orders for farmers, fish harvesters, and processors through tariff reductions on canola, lobster, crab, and peas. But the energy component represents a much larger long-term opportunity. Current Canadian petroleum exports to China have grown dramatically following the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion that came online in May of 2024. That project created Pacific export capacity for crude oil, allowing Canadian petroleum to load onto tankers and ship to Asian refineries rather than being captive to American refineries. The result has been a 240% increase in petroleum exports to China in the first 9 months of 2025, growing from approximately $2.4 billion annually to a projected $8 billion for the full year. That massive growth in a single year demonstrates the pent-up demand for Canadian energy in Asian markets once infrastructure exists to deliver it. But petroleum represents an immediate opportunity using existing pipeline infrastructure. LNG represents a long-term transformation requiring entirely new facilities and $109 billion in new investment. This creates an industry that did not exist previously, opens markets Canada never accessed, and establishes permanent Pacific energy trade relationships. The timeline for this transformation is clear and accelerating. LNG Canada is ramping up production now, having shipped its first 6 tankers and targeting 1 cargo departure every 2 days once fully operational. That will generate 14 million tons annually from the initial 2 processing trains, with potential expansion to 28 million tons if 2 additional trains are built. Other projects are following on schedule. Cedar LNG is targeting a 2028 start date. Woodfibre LNG aims for 2028 as well. Ksi Lisims is projected for 2029. Additional projects will come online in the early 2030s. By 2030, the full 50 million ton annual capacity will be operational, serving Asian markets that the United States cannot reach because American LNG must travel much farther to Asian destinations. Chinese buyers have already committed through long-term purchase agreements, equity investments in production facilities, infrastructure financing, and political commitments secured through the Ksi Carney meetings in Beijing. This is locked in as a permanent shift in Canadian energy orientation. President Trump never anticipated this outcome. He assumed Canadian energy would forever flow to the United States. He assumed geography dictated trade patterns and that pipelines pointing south meant Canada had no alternatives. All of those assumptions have proven catastrophically wrong. The Trans Mountain Pipeline broke the first assumption by creating Pacific export capacity for oil, proving that Canada can reach Asian markets profitably, despite longer distances and demonstrating that Asian demand is real and growing. LNG Canada and the expansion projects now complete the transformation. 50 million tons annually flowing to Asia, none to the United States. $109 billion in Chinese and Asian investment. Permanent infrastructure oriented toward Pacific trade. American energy dominance over Canada has been eliminated. President Trump's threats accelerated this exact outcome. His tariffs and annexation suggestions made Canadian energy executives realize the American market represents political risk rather than commercial opportunity. His unpredictability made Canadian policymakers prioritize diversification as a matter of national security. His aggression made Asian investors more attractive partners because they offered stability and respect rather than chaos and threats. Trump's behavior became the catalyst for precisely the outcome he wanted to prevent. The irony is complete and devastating for American strategic interests. Trump wanted to maintain American energy dominance. He wanted control over allied energy supplies as leverage to force policy compliance on other issues. Instead, he pushed Canada to build infrastructure that permanently eliminates American leverage. And the reversal is impossible to undo. You cannot tear down liquefaction facilities that cost tens of billions to construct. You cannot redirect Pacific terminals that were purpose-built for Asian markets. You cannot break decades-long contracts that guarantee supply to Chinese, Japanese, and Korean buyers. You cannot refund the Chinese investment that owns equity stakes in production facilities. The infrastructure creates irreversible facts on the ground. 5 years from now, Canada will be shipping 50 million tons of LNG annually to Asia. Chinese companies will own equity in the production facilities. Asian buyers will consume the output. The United States will be completely bypassed. Trump's energy weapon will be neutralized. Canada's Asian orientation will be permanent. From the Canadian perspective, this represents liberation from dependency on American goodwill. From the Chinese perspective, this is a strategic victory that secures energy supply from a democratic partner while diversifying away from the Middle East and Russia. From Trump's perspective, this is a catastrophic failure, whereas attempts to increase leverage actually eliminated that leverage completely. Energy infrastructure lasts for generations. These liquefaction facilities will operate until 2070, long after current political leaders are gone. The infrastructure creates a permanent reality of Canada-China energy partnership and American market irrelevance that no future president can easily reverse.